cold day. Yeah, welcome. While you're waiting, you might want to go ahead and log in to or open up your pods. Uh, we'll be starting here at the top of the hour. So load up your pods, chat pods. We can send you stuff, and the Q&A so you can send us stuff. But we will be doing polls via pollev.com as well. Another minute or so, we'll be starting up. Again, you're going to want to go ahead and open up your pods, your chat pod and your Q&A pod. And we'll be taking polls over at pollev.com/DavidOrP. We'll give folks about 30 more seconds to finish logging in, and then we'll get started. Okay. Good numbers. Okay, good morning, and welcome to our webinar on road and street legal issues. My name's David Orr. I'm the director here with Cornell Local Roads Program. We're your New York State LTAP Center, and this is one of our foundational webinar series. We're get started here. Again, we're doing polls, and I'll talk about that. We'll get you some practice on that a little bit, and we'll go ahead and get started. This is the second of our webinars that we're doing here in the January, February, early March timeframe. We take off when there are conflicting events, holidays. Like for instance, next week we don't have a session because the county highway superintendents are meeting up in Saratoga Springs, and we'll be up there instead. We did have one earlier last week, but these are the ones today and through the rest of the session. The ones with stars are worth a professional development hour. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. Once we're done with our webinars, you may want to come to one of our spring workshops. We have a whole series of them go all over the state. And we also have a series of work zone workshops that we got a grant to help cover. So there's no additional fee for that because you've already paid for it with the grant monies that we got. So you can join us at either or both events. Come to workshops, come to webinars, come to work zone workshops. We'd be glad to see you in all those things. And hopefully we'll see you on the road this spring. Now, if you haven't been on one of these webinars before, remember your audio settings are down in the lower left. We will be sending you out links. In fact, we'll be repeating that here in just about another 30 seconds. That will have a link to our handout, a link to the poll site, so you don't have to type it in. It's a one-way. It's closed for you putting comments in. If you have comments or have a question, and please put in any questions, you can do that via the Q&A pod that's down there. And I'm probably going to ask you to raise your hand a few times, so make sure you know where that feature is as well. Now, this is worth one professional development hour here in New York State. Only the person who was registered can get credit for it, just because we got to follow some rules from the education department. It is counted, however, as a course, which is good because you need half of your PDHs here to be worth courses. In fact, that's all I've got. I think I have to get 3 course hours between now and November for my own license. If you're from another state, you'll need to check with your LTAP center, though I will tell you this particular one is pretty, well, not completely New York focused, but it's got more of a New York focus than some of the others because we specifically cover some New York state law issues. Now, before we get started, a caveat. You'll notice I said David Orr PE. I'm an engineer. I'm not a lawyer. I've learned an awful lot about highway law over a few decades. Well, okay, more. But quite a bit of time, dark hair to gray hair. But everything I'm talking about is legal. You're going to need to talk to your counsel. You're going to need to understand that everything is case specific. and things may change. So when you go to actually, if you have to actually go to court, we're big fans of trying to do things well before you get to court. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So now let's find out who you are. That'll help me figure out what we might go in terms of our focus today. So we'll do a bit of a welcome using the Poll EV system. So it's pollev.com/DavidOrPE. And here we go. So, oh, that's right. I changed my order to myself last night. I was like, let's do this a little different. Before we do the poll, um, where is this material coming from? Well, we have a series of workshops. We have a workshop that talks about rights and responsibilities that we started rolling out only a couple of years ago, reducing liability the year before that. And then we do actually pull some stuff in today from our Running Your Highway Department class. So if you're interested, those would be three that have a good focus on some of these legal issues that we're talking about. Now, who do you work for? Do you work for a town, a county, a city or village, state or federal, tribal, MPO, consultant, contractor, or you're everybody's working for the weekend? So let's see who we've got in our crowd today. Okay, so we have, oh, that's a good blend. I like to see it. We have a lot of town and county folks. We have city and village, state and federal, some consultants, a few folks who are honest and work for the weekend. And again, if you have an issue accessing the polls, you can throw them into the Q&A, and I'll just add that to my thoughts, especially when we do open-ended questions. That can be very helpful, and I'll repeat them for folks. And Amanda and Jody sitting in the background will take care of everything. It's pretty amazing. Okay. So again, if you can't log in, just type the answers into the poll. That will work just fine. Okay. Cool. Okay. Let's see. What's your job? Are you an administrator? Are you the highway superintendent, deputy, commissioner, things like that? Are you an engineer, primarily a planner, part of the field crew, a supervisor, or a board member? Or are you none of the above? Let's see what we got here. Hey, we got a board member today. I like it. If you type in none of the above, do me a favor and type into the Q&A what that is, so that you know what that title is. We might even add it into our list of possibles. We added MPOs because of comments that you guys had. So for instance, I've got a road foreman, an engineer, highway superintendent, a couple more engineers. Okay, cool. Okay, so a lot of engineers in the crowd, probably because of the PDHs. I'm not surprised by that, but that's okay. Okay. And then how long have you been in your current job? That's really useful for me. It gives me a good sense of how long you've been there. Are you brand new? Are you somebody who's been there a long time? So over in the Q&A, I see we've got a good range there as well. So we've got folks 5 to 10, 26, 7, uh, a 1 to 2, somebody who's retired. That's not how long you've worked. That's retired. We all want to do that someday. Okay, good variety. We have a couple of folks who are really new, though, so that's something we'll talk about. Hopefully, we'll help you out, and again, hopefully, start a conversation to go from there. And then, where in New York State are you from? You can, in this case, you get to click on the map. It's pretty cool, and we'll populate and see where everybody's from. Okay. Oh, we have somebody from Canada, or they're at least in Canada right now. Okay. Wow, good variety, but it's a big crowd today. And then somebody has put in that from Westchester, Cat County. Okay. North Syracuse to add to the dots that we've already got there. So a good variety of folks all over the place. And obviously I'm in Ithaca, in Tompkins County, though the picture behind me is from the walkway over the Hudson. It goes from between Lloyd and Poughkeepsie. Okay. So let's talk about the law. Now, everything starts with the law. And, if you've ever read Oliver Twist or watched the musical Oliver, you talk about the guy who ran the essentially workhouse for orphans. And his wife did something wrong, but back then the law said he was responsible. They said it was no excuse, and he says something he's not supposed to say. I won't repeat it, but you all know the phrase. The law is an interesting thing. It changes, okay? And so this is the thing we need to understand. So let's focus for just a second. Let's talk about traffic control devices. And that includes your signs, your stripes, your pavement markings, your signals, all those kind of fun things. And how do we get to the point where we know what to put up, and why do we do those different things? Why is this none of these signs really meet the requirements properly. Well, partly because we've set up policies and laws, but there are bases in all of this, and there's reasons we have this. And when we do our webinar on signs, we'll talk about that in a lot more detail. But the basis of all of what we do actually is our Constitution, either federal level or state level. And I know sometimes it doesn't seem that way, but that is supposed to be the basis of things. Those can be changed. Probably should be hard to change those. And there's laws that are passed by legislatures. There's federal law, there's state law, and then there can be a local law. Okay? Now, there can be a regulation. These are put on top of the law. Hopefully the law was well written, and regulations are fairly easy to put together, but not always, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. An agency or an organization can set policies that's followed. Okay, that's usually done at the departmental level. You can have a guide that takes all of the information and combines it together, and there might be an agreement or a contract that uses all of these things below it. And so anytime you have an agreement or a contract, you're actually following through with everything underneath. So let's go back to our signs issue and let's talk about where that might be. So again, we'll talk with our Constitution. I don't know the preamble of the New York State Constitution. Maybe I should learn it, but we all know we the people. Okay. In order to form a more perfect union and all that fun stuff. In fact, if you're a child of the 70s like me, you can sing the preamble because they put it to song and Schoolhouse Rock stuff. But there's the Constitution, and then there are laws that are written on top of these constitutions at the federal and state level. So there's laws for the state of New York. This is a cover of one from the 1800s. Highway law, there are components of New York State highway law that predate the state. Okay, and then of course there's the creation of towns in the 1800s, and there's laws that are written. Now realize that when a law is written, it has to make sure it doesn't conflict with the higher authority. So you can't write a state law that conflicts with the U.S. Constitution. And you can't write a local law that conflicts with the state constitution, and so on. And so just realize these bases also have a federal, state, and local aspect to them as well. Now, the regulation that we deal with for signs is the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, and there's a national manual of uniform traffic controls. And that the manual was updated technically December of 2023 on the cover of the book, but actually 2024 was when it was actually promulgated and became the rule, and New York State adopted that rule fairly shortly afterwards at the state DOT level. Now, New York State does have a supplement to the old MUTCD. It's still in place. So if you have to put up a sign, you need to check the new national, the old supplement, and which would control, again, federal standard, it would be the Federal Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices it would control versus the New York State supplement. They are working on a new supplement, and that will get approved by the Federal Highway Administration. But these are all regulations. Now, you can have a policy. Policy, for instance, whether you put up children at play signs or not. So I'm going to lower everybody's hands for just a second. Please raise your hand if your agency puts up children at play signs. Raise your hand if you put up children at play signs. Okay. Now, if you do, and you have, but you should have a consistent policy of when you put those signs up, because do they really meet the requirements? Do they perform a need? Do they actually change driver behavior? These are policies that you would have, okay? And so this is a policy you would write at, generally, again, local departmental level kind of thing, okay? Now, you may have a guide that you put out that helps you figure out information on your policy, and you share that information with others. Our traffic sign handbook that we have, that traffic sign handbook actually was originally done by the State Department of Transportation. It's just a guide. It's not a policy. It's not a regulation. It actually technically can't be used in court, at least according to the Department of State. But it's used by lots of people because it helps guide them and helps them make sure they don't fail to meet the standards. Okay? And of course, if you have a 284 agreement that says to do X, Y, or Z between the town board and the highway department, that's an agreement. It's not a contract, and there is a difference between an agreement and a contract. And we'll get into a little bit of that today. But again, all of those agreements and contracts all fall from the guides, the policies, and the regulations that come into play. Now, in highway world, it really matters what our responsibilities are. So let's fill out. This is a Wordle. We're going to create a Wordle. So do this in one-word segments. What are some responsibilities of highway and public works departments? And you can put those into the Q&A if you can't access uh, the poll on pollev.com/davidorpe. Safety, maintenance of the road, maybe public transportation, dealing with the roads, clearing whatever you might clear, snow. Okay, somebody's put safety over in the Q&A. Infrastructure, possibly sewer. Yeah, there might be additional duties that you've got. Okay, public safety, pedestrian safety operations. I'm reading some of the ones from the Q&A. Trees. Okay. If you have a water department, there'd be water. There's rules and regulations and requirements for putting in water. And there's all of these things come back to having a legal component of why we do them and a legal component of what we are required to do. Okay? So keep that in mind as we're thinking about our legal issues and how do we do the right thing for everybody. And you can make a list of your own agency and know that it might change slightly. And again, you might have trails, you might have utilities beyond highway. Now, if you're with a town, you should have this book, okay? If you do not have this book and you work for a town, go get a copy from the Association of Towns. If you're a member, you can get a copy, and you can even get an electronic copy, which is pretty cool. If you are not with a town, but you're with a county, still get yourself a copy of this book. There's enough things on county roads that fall from the old town highway rules in the 1800s. You want a copy of this book. It's really sort of the guide to being a town highway superintendent, but it has some very good information. Now, if you work for a village or a city, there are some equivalent guides from the New York Conference of Mayors, NYCOM. But again, make sure you have good resources available to you. So I'm going to lower everybody's hands. McKinney's Consolidated Laws of New York list the law and has the summary of the case studies that go with it. And we'll be talking about a few of those through the course of our time together. Most agencies should have at least a couple of chapters. For instance, if you're a town or county, you should have highway law. If you're a village, you should have village law. If you're a city, you should have city law. Raise your hand if you know where you can pick up a copy right now. Raise your hand in your office. Can you go pick up a copy of the highway law? Even if you work for a consulting firm, you should at least know where you can get a copy. Okay? Because you're going to want to refer to things. When you're dealing with right-of-way, when you're dealing with utilities, when you're dealing with who can cut down a tree, what's the width, all those kind of things. Even in some cases, who is responsible for a particular stretch of highway. You should be able to have a copy. Now, if you want to look at all of the case law, okay, for all of the different laws, and there are literally, almost 100 of these books. I don't know the exact number, but there's plenty of them. You should go out and be able to find a copy at your county clerk's office, if nothing else. Or if you've got a local library that carries them. A lot of universities, Cornell, for instance, has a law school, so it has a law library access, though there's certain times of year I can't get in there, but I can get in there most of the time, okay? But you should know where the case law is. And those case laws are really, really critical because the law might say one thing, but the case law is what's going to be followed. And those cases can be due to the courts making a decision, to judges. It could be a decision made by a regulatory agency or by the Attorney General, an opinion from the comptroller, things like that. And those things will actually control until, of course, there might be another case that comes along. Okay, so keep that in mind. It's definitely worth something you should have available to you. So as an example of something that might come up is a mailbox. Okay, now, how many of you have mailbox policy? Mailboxes. Raise your hand. How many of you have mailbox policies? Yeah, a lot of you do. Those policies do follow all the way back through those regulations and rules and laws and things like that. There are actually some rights for people to put mailboxes in the right of way, but they can't just put up whatever they want. They have to put them up at your discretion as the highway manager or the street operator. Okay? And it has to be done in such a way that it doesn't create a safety hazard. And so there are standards out there through the post office, and you can set your own policy as well. Okay? So anything we're doing might have a basis in law. Now let's talk about maybe the most controversial law in New York State. Let's start with a simple one. You get to click on the map here. Where is the edge of the right-of-way? Mark the edge of the right-of-way, and let's see what y'all come up with. We got people clicking what the edge of the right-of-way is here. I've got fence. I've got one person, couple of people in front of the tree. I've got some people who put it at the edge of the pavement. Okay. All kinds of fun choices here. Some people are up in the trees, way off on the road. So right-of-way in New York State can get very, very complicated. And by the way, if this is a road by use or street by prescription, that right-of-way may have to be decided in a court case. The rule of thumb for right-of-way is this. If you have a deed, a piece of paper that describes the right-of-way, that's the right-of-way. If you don't have a deed, it's probably a road by use or street by prescription, and so you're going to get an easement, or you're going to have a by use kind of situation. Now, easements can be in writing as well, so you get a bit of a bit of an odd duck there in some respects. You can actually get a paper easement or a by use easement. So that's why I listed three different things. Okay, so let's talk about these three items: the deed, the easements, and the by use. Now, the deed would be nice if every road were deeded. Okay, so a deed essentially is a piece of paper filed with the county clerk, okay, attached to the property. Okay, to find those deeds, you can go down and look at the tax maps, though we'll come back to that in just a minute. Be very careful. Uh, Main thing you're doing with the tax map is to find out where the deed is. The book, the library, the page, all that fun stuff. And most counties, you can find that information online these days. You might have to pay a fee, but you can find the deed and you should have your own deed if you own property. Okay? And that deed will list the right-of-way. It may be an in fee. The county or town or village may actually own the road in fee and actually have a piece of property as well, but it's still going to be filed with a deed. Okay? Now, you might have an easement as well. Okay? An easement can be temporary or permanent. If it's permanent, it really should be attached to the deed and filed with the clerk's office. Okay? Really should be. There are some ways to do it through the town or village clerk. I'm a big fan of filing everything at the county clerk's office, especially now that they're doing things electronically. So if there was ever a fire or some damage, we'd be able to recreate and get the proper deeds. But make sure you have easements, and those easements spell out what the responsibilities are. A lot of utilities are done via the easement system. If you're ever getting federal aid, by the way, you have to have an in-writing easement before you can proceed to certain phases of a project. You cannot use roads by use and streets by prescription. Okay, you have to have something in writing. Okay, both for your temporary work and your permanent work. And when people ask us temporary versus permanent, that's easy. If you're going to be back, you need a permanent easement. So if you're doing a drainage improvement, if you ever have to clean it out again, that's permanent. If you're removing a tree, it's probably temporary. If you're parking equipment overnight, it's probably temporary. So again, make sure you have an easement for what you do. So let's talk a little bit about by use. Now, the law is one paragraph in highway law. Uh, there's also a section in village law that says exactly the same thing with a couple of minor word differences, but the court cases that go with it. Remember McKinney's little book I said you should have a copy of? If you count the pages of just the summaries in McKinney's for the town portion and the village portion of roads by use, streets by prescription, it's over 20 pages, just the summaries. But you can distill it down and get yourself pretty close most of the time if you remember this, okay? It's what is actually used and maintained by the municipality, okay? So whether it's a road or not, and the width of the right-of-way is by whether it's actually used and maintained. And the use has to be the public use, not a driveway, not just two houses. It has to be a public use. A road going to a church or a building that's a commercial property. that's a public use. A road that connects from point A to point B, that's a public use. But the width is also what's been maintained by the municipality. So if they haven't maintained it, well, it's not part of the right-of-way. So for instance, that tree in the picture we looked at, that tree is a fixed object. Once it gets big enough to be a fixed object, really, you haven't maintained it. So you've lost that right-of-way. So if we go back to that picture, let me get my slide number to make sure I get it right. Technology being what it is. The right-of-way in this case would certainly not be behind that tree. It might be to the fence line where the fence is. It actually can move, okay? Because again, that fence would be outside the public's maintained road, okay? By the way, it could be as narrow as the actual pavement if they've never actually done anything with that swale, okay? So the right-of-ways by use can get very, very tricky very, very quickly. So keep that in mind. Okay, so it's what you've actually used and maintained and is public use. Now, some people like to go to tax maps and look at the tax map and say, hey, the tax map says that's the right-of-way, it's X, Y, or Z. And the law says it's a 3-rod because the law specifically says that the superintendent or village shall maintain to a 3-rod road. No. Don't use those, please. Because the courts, remember, case law, the courts have pretty much said, no, anything beyond which has been used or maintained for 10 or more years, you have to purchase it or get an agreement to get it. Okay, you can't just take that land. That's unconstitutional. Going back to the basis of our law, it's an unconstitutional taking. So you cannot take it. And if you're wondering, by the way, you can lose right-of-way in only 6 years. You can gain it in 10. Okay, one of those weird quirks that comes into play. So let's look at some trees. In this particular case, those trees, now that they've grown up and become fixed objects, have changed the right-of-way on this road by use. Before, it might have been that fence line. Now, it's going to be the front side of that tree. So if you wanted to remove that tree from a legal standpoint, you'd have to be very careful. Now, could you remove that from a safety standpoint? You might be able to. You could actually make a very cogent argument that we're going to set a tree policy. We're going to remove trees that are within our clear zone. The board has the right to do something called measures of control. They can set a policy. However, you may have to compensate the landowner for the tree, and they still own the wood. Okay? So, again, if we had a whole day, and we do in our rights and responsibilities class, talk about these issues, but trees is a major issue. Okay? Now, I've got a note here. I'm looking at the question here. Somebody says, the limit of what public use is worked by the DPW, defined limit when the 3-rod right-of-way. Yeah, essentially it goes back to the same rules. The width is what's been used and maintained by the municipality, okay? The limit is only for highway purposes, by the way. If there's a utility underneath, that doesn't affect the right-of-way. The utilities are separate. This is just for highway and streets, okay? So keep that in mind. So back to our item for right-of-way in this case, we have to not take land unconstitutionally. There are laws in place to hold this, but courts have ruled on those. Those case law become important, and then there can be regulations put on top of that as well. So something to keep in mind as we move forward, okay? Now, in terms of powers and duties, we got our friendly Spider-Man here. Powers and duties, there's responsibilities, which is one of the reasons we've renamed the class Rights and Responsibilities, because it's pretty important, okay? Now, somebody over in the Q&A has put, again, please put your questions in the Q&A. It says, we have a lot of right-of-way that goes through private yards and behind houses. Do you need to do anything in particular to access these? Again, do you have records that you've done this for 10 or more years? And I'm a big fan of documenting. We'll talk about logs here in a little bit. Make sure you've got documentation that you've done it for a period of 10 or more years, okay? And check the deeds and make sure the deeds might tell you you have some right-of-way to access that. They may not mention width, okay? They may just mention the road, A lot of deeds say to the center line of the road, but they specifically mention the rights of the roadway. And if they do that, it is a public road, but the width may be controlled by what you've maintained. And again, it's 27 pages and we only have an hour. But again, you want to make sure you understand that. So let's go back to our list of responsibilities. Remember, everything on this list is going to have some legal basis behind it. And the reason safety pops up, it's liability, which we'll be talking about in the webinar in a few weeks. But snow clearing, even the sewer work, even though, again, I said there are some caveats with roads by use, these are all legal things that we're supposed to do. And whether they're done at the regulatory level or the law level, it really can make a big difference on how we move forward with our activities. Okay? So let's just ask, what reports do you have to do annually? There's actually regulations out there, and even the law in a few places, where there's certain reports you're required to do every single year if you work for a town, county, village, or city. Give me some of those. Oh, local highway inventory. Yep, absolutely. You have to do that if you want your CHIPS funds. That's the thing. They'll say you can have this if you do that. Okay? Your MS4, if you're in a municipal separate storm sewer system area, you're going to have a report on that. Yes, you're required to do an equipment inventory, especially towns. It's actually in the law that talks about that. Okay, there may be PESH and OSHA inspections that you're going to have. Your daily work reports. Okay, they may not be required by regulation, but boy, they help you with liability later on. Bridges have to be inspected once every 2 years. Okay? Any shared service agreements that you've got with somebody else, you need to have those in place before you do the work, or you can risk losing the funds. Okay? You might want to inventory of your signs. Surprisingly, a lot of things we do in the world of highway and public works are not required, but they show back up later on if we're trying to do asset management or trying to reduce liability. And some are required, such as an ADA transition plan. That's a good one. In fact, since we're here, we have a couple of minutes. We're actually pretty good time-wise. Raise your hand if you have an ADA transition plan in your agency. Raise your hand. Yeah, you definitely want to have that. It's actually required. The interesting thing, it's not required that you start immediately doing things if you have a plan. If you don't have a plan, you can be forced to. So I know of cases, and I won't say names, but I know of a case where a village had a plan, and it was a 20-year plan to get everything put in place for their ADA. Another village, similar size, did not have a plan. When the Department of Justice came in, it's actually the state that came in, they had 3 years to do the entire village because they didn't have a plan. Go start thinking about putting these plans together. It can really be very helpful. So let's talk about probably the agreement that is the most common at least at the town level. It's called a 284 agreement. Don't read this, just this is the official paperwork, though there's some issues with that. But the 284 agreement is an agreement, not a contract, an agreement between the board and the highway superintendent on how certain funds are going to be spent. Okay? So, even if you're with a county or a village or a city, you should probably have some equivalent agreement. So, do you have an agreement with the board? Yes, submitted to the board only, not signed by everybody. Informal agreements, no, you don't have one or you're not sure. Okay? And I'll look at the Q&A as well. And we got a yes there. We have a not sure. If you're with a town, you can literally be on the hook for some cost if you don't have that. You're not legally supposed to spend monies without that agreement. That agreement can be very helpful. It has to be signed by at least 3 of the 5 board members and the highway superintendent. It can be changed at any time. It's not a contract. So if there's a flooding event or there was a big fire and you need to change something, redo the 284 agreement. The whole point is just it's a communication tool. Treat it as such and you'll be okay. And so even if you work for a county or a city or a village and you don't have the formal requirement, it's still a good idea to have something in place that says, yep, we know what we're going to be doing this year and how we're going to be spending the money. Where are our capital projects? What kind of maintenance are we going to do? People ask us how much detail this has to have. As long as everybody's happy, We're all happy. I'm a big fan of the ones where the capital projects are written out in pretty good detail. The maintenance is done as a total amount, and then the highway official lists what's going to be done and shares that with the board, so at least have a chance to review it before they move forward. So we have flexibility, but we're talking and communicating with each other. Now, another one that comes up quite often is FOIL, or FOIA, because it's technically the Freedom of Information Act. Okay, but Freedom of Information Law is cool because it's got a nice acronym of FOIL. These essentially means if somebody requests certain records, they're allowed to have access to them. Now, there may be charges to cover the cost of making the records, but you have to provide the records in a reasonable basis, and there's rules about how long you keep records and what records are available and things like that. Not all records are available. You know, records about personnel, records about medical stuff. Be careful about that, okay? Let's just ask simple. How many of you, again, I'm going to lower your hands. I'm making you lower and raise your hands a lot today. How many of you keep a daily log? How many of you keep a daily log? Raise your hand. You keep a daily log. Now with email, you're almost doing that by trade, but yeah. Okay, here's the cool thing about a daily log and the risk of a daily log. I'm going to lower your hands again. About a quarter of you. Going to lower your hands. How many of you, excuse me, not, that's the wrong question. Is a daily log foilable by the public? Raise your hand if you think it is. Wow, a lot of you think it is. Actually, it's not. A daily log, a personal, private daily log is not foilable. However, if you wish to use it in a court case, it becomes foilable. Okay? So you can write down all these things, but realize that it can become a public record if it gets into a legal lawsuit kind of situation. So you want to write these things down, but if it's something you want as a permanent record that's public kind of access, write it into a report, file the report. That becomes the foilable activity. So a weather forecast and things like that. It can get very confusing very quickly, just to keep that in mind. And the reason they did that was it's almost like private conversations with yourself and attorney-private client privilege kind of activities. But again, as soon as any part of it is available, the whole thing can be. So just be aware of that issue. It can create some challenges for you. Now, what should be in your daily log? What kind of activities should be in your daily log? And this time, I'm going to have you put your answers in before I share them with everybody. Make you think a little bit. What should be in the daily log? What should be in the daily? And somebody's put in the Q&A an answer. I'll mention that in a sec. Okay. And then we'll go to the responses and see. And the same thing showed up in the Q&A. Yep. Weather, activities, people, phone calls. Again, really should be logging these things because you can't remember them. Nobody's going to remember what happened a year ago. Okay? And again, if it's something you want to make as a permanent record that then you can share with the public, put it down in a daily log, daily report that gets filed with that road, with that project, things like that. But again, try to be consistent. Always put your name, by the way. Always have your name on any report. Somebody's name should be on any piece of paper. And you've got that in there. I see that. Very good. Nice job. Okay. Now, in terms of emergencies, let's talk a little bit about some emergencies. Emergencies come up all the time. Some of the rules can be thrown out when there's an emergency, rules about bidding, rules about closures and things like that. But emergencies, you still should be thinking about what is the legal basis, okay, of these things and who can declare an emergency. In most cases, an emergency is declared by the highest elected official or the highest public safety official within a particular municipality. So at the state level, that would be the governor. At a county level, it's usually the county legislative or chief supervisor. Okay, whoever's the head of the county legislature would be doing that. Okay, or the board of supervisors. At a town level, it would be the supervisor. Okay, And so these are things just to realize. But it could also be the sheriff. The sheriff can close roads, okay? Again, depending on the situation. But at the end of it, let's do the right thing, and then we can make sure people are safe, and then we can worry about going from there. Because safety can trump almost anything. Now, in terms of liability and risk, we're going to have a whole webinar on this later, but because a lot of what we do deals with liability, let's just touch on it for just a second. What are some ways to reduce liability? Just throw a few of those in here. And again, we'll talk about them, the legal aspects of them here in just a sec. Documentation. Documentation not only protects you in court, but also is good from a communication standpoint. Yeah, paper. Keeping it in writing. Probably one of the best things to do. Doing things properly, taking that extra time, making sure you've got your local laws in place and that you follow those. Training. And of course, what's the first things we cut? Training and maintenance. And here they are in our list. And yet, they tend to be easy to cut. And do what you say you're going to do. Make sure you've implemented best practices. Yeah. Essentially, if you think about it, it all comes back to if you do what you say you're going to do and you follow the law to the best of your ability. You can't always do 100%. We don't have unlimited funds. You have a plan and you follow through, you're going to really reduce your liability. And yes, I'm a huge fan of pictures. And of course, we all have a camera these days because we all have cell phones. Okay. Again, we're going to have a whole webinar on that. We'll talk about that later on. But again, safety is our primary driver. So do me a favor. When you're thinking about safety, think about your family, think about your friends, and think about cutting that tree down till it's flush. Don't leave it sticking up. Don't cut down a tree and leave a stump. No, that's not good from anybody's standpoint, legal or not. Okay. Now, in terms of being put on notice, you can be put on notice that there's a defect, and then you have to go out and respond to that, either by saying, I'm going to do something or we're not going to do something. Now, there are two types of protection. There is something called written, sometimes called actual notice, and constructive notice. Okay? Now, written notice or actual notice essentially says someone has to put in writing to you that something has occurred. Okay? Now, a phone call or in writing from the police counts the same. That's where the word actual is sometimes used. But essentially, you have to be notified of something before it occurs. Towns, you have to pass a local law to get that full protection. So if you don't have that, go check and see. You get snow and ice protection, but you need to pass a local law to get full protection for all road defects. Okay? Counties, very limited. There are some limited protections. There's not much you can do to pass them. You can set some policies, but they're limited. But there's still some. Okay? You can still be reasonable written notice. Okay? Villages, you get it completely by state law. Get all the protection. Villages need to do nothing, and cities, it will come down to their charter and local laws they pass based upon that charter. The constructive notice side essentially says, you should have known about it. And so even if someone has not put something in writing, if it's so obvious, it's been there for so long, or the agency did it, you're on constructive notice. So if you built this curb ramp like this, you're on notice. There's no need to put it in writing. If it's been there for a year, yeah, you're on notice. If it's right outside the highway garage, you see it every day, you're on notice. So constructive notice can occur without something putting in writing. And of course, as soon as this happens, not only do you have the liability, you have the responsibility to go in and repair it. Have a plan in place for inspections and to put it on the list to get the work done. That can protect you liability-wise and communicate better with the public. Now, in terms of some other things that we got to deal with from a legal standpoint, financial concerns are a major issue. A lot of what we do deals with money, okay? And so we could spend a whole webinar, we have a whole webinar, on budgets and spendings, and understanding account codes and ledger codes and object codes, and all of this comes back just really a communication tool, okay? There are 1,580 municipalities in the state. A lot of them have not put in reports to the comptroller on a reasonable basis. Some of them are 3-4 years out. How, as a citizen, do we know the monies are being spent properly if they're not filing the proper reports and following through with the proper accounts? If you're spending money in the wrong account, how do we know it's really being taxed? So the primary accounts we care about in the world of highways, general fund, that's where the superintendent, the office cost comes from. The buildings actually come out of the general fund. For towns, there's DA and DB accounts, and for counties, there's D and DM, machinery, okay? By the way, for villages and cities, it's always an A charge, but have good object codes out of that. And you can have a subdivided budget, that's fine. You could set a special account. In fact, capital projects, we actually recommend you use a capital projects fund to keep things separate, especially if you're getting a federal aid or a big slug of funds. It's a good way to track things and make sure you keep things separate. It's easier to track, okay? Now, going to lower your hands one more time. Ask you, how many of you have a purchasing policy? Raise your hand. Hopefully everybody raises your hand. Yeah, a lot of you. Good. You should have a purchasing policy. Okay? That purchasing policy covers when you can go out and do different kind of purchases. Okay? So for instance, when can you go get a direct purchase? Okay? Just go buy something. What that limit is, I've seen that limit as low as $50. I've seen that limit as high as $2,000. Probably needs to be between those two. What's a reasonable amount where you can just go buy it? Okay? There's oral quotes. Now, we document these on a piece of paper, but they're called oral quotes because you can take them over the phone. You still need to get 3 of them, okay? Versus a written quote where they have to supply it back. It's not a full bid system. And again, the limits on these, I've seen them vary by quite a bit. What we're trying to figure out is when do we have to go out and set these policies, okay? And then, of course, you could have bids, and there will be exemptions to those bids, and I'll talk about the amount of funds that we deal with here in just a second that we have to go out to bid, okay? Make sure I do have that slide still showing. I do, okay? Okay. I do see the question in the Q&A. Leave it up. I'll get to it in just a second when we get to that. Purchasing policy. Again, we could spend a whole session on these limits, but before I talk about bids, give me some exceptions to competitive bidding. What are some exceptions to competitive bidding? When can we not go out to bid, even though we're above the bid limits were set by state law or by the local board? An emergency contract, absolutely. Emergencies is probably the most common, but you still should be using best practices, okay? If you're using somebody else's contract, OGS, piggybacking, yeah, someone else has already done the work, you can use theirs. When you're doing professional services, you're hiring an architect, an engineer, you still may need to go through what's called an RFP process, request for proposal, but you don't go out to bids. In fact, in some cases, you cannot use money as the driver to decide between A, B, and C when it's professional services. Okay, so there are exceptions. You can sole source a particular thing. Sole source can be challenging, but it can be useful. If, for instance, you want to have a single type of truck within the fleet, think of Southwest Airlines and 737s as an example of a sole source, where they always buy the same thing. Okay, so there are some exceptions out there. Leases, by the way, come into the exceptions. Purchasing from other governments, in some cases, can fall into that. Again, make sure you look at those carefully. Okay, and yes, piggybacking on others. Now, when do you have to go out for competitive bidding? Well, general municipal law sets the limits, 103, for public works at 35,000 and purchases at 20,000. And if you're wondering whether it's a purchase or a public works, think about this. Is there a service being provided as part of it, or is it really at the end of the day just an item that you've just purchased, okay? And somebody put it in and installed it for you. It's still just a purchase of an item. And yes, it can get very gray, and we'll have a question here as we end our time together. We're going to ask you what the difference between those two is, okay? So let's put it all together, okay? Now, standards and policies, agreements and contracts, okay? You're going to have everything from the Constitution up to your agreements. You're going to have your standards and your policies and your regulations. So the Q&A question that I said I would get back to, it's a good time to answer as any. It says, whose responsibility is it on clearing the sidewalk, the property owner or the town? Well, that depends on what policies have been set. How is it installed? Who installed it? The town actually has a right to set a policy that says the town is required to clear it. They also have the right to set a policy that says the homeowner has that responsibility. So, for instance, here in Ithaca, the people who have a sidewalk in front of their house have to clear it for snow. Meanwhile, in Cayuga Heights, just north, the village, they clear the sidewalks. It's a board level decision set by the board. Okay, but remember, the board can't set a policy that contravenes state or federal law. Okay, so again, these are the kind of things that create challenges. Main thing there, have a policy. So standards and policies. So this is a standard that was developed for low volume roads for geometric design. Just as an example of the kind of policies you might want to make sure you've got, let's just see, how many of you have a written standard for your roads and streets? How many of you have a written standard for your roads and streets? You can say yes, you can say we use the state's standards, you can say no, you can say you're not sure, and I left a none of the above just in case some of you had some other answer like a mixed system or something like that. Okay? So most of you have written standards. Good. That's good to know. Written standards do three things for us. They're great from a liability standpoint. They're really good from a communication standpoint. And to me, most importantly, they provide a better quality of roads and improve safety. Okay? So they're really valuable to have. And you can use the state standards, but realize sometimes they might be overkill. We do have some on our website, and in the handout, there's a link to them if you'd like to look at what we've got available. But I'm glad to see nobody hit no today. That's actually pretty good. Now, let's look at hard hats. Okay, hard hats are really valuable. This is a picture of a guy he was cutting trees and it snapped. I've met the guy. And the tree did hit the hard hat and it popped out, some of the plastic. But it did its job. It was still ductile. He walked away with no injury other than a bit of a fright. Okay, versus these engineers, I hate to say, they were on a rock slide out in Oregon. Colleague sent us this picture. And then when asked where their hard hats were, they were like, well, if a big rock falls, they're going to die. Yeah, but if the pebbles that were still coming down could give them a concussion. So, yep, you should have a policy on hard hats. So who sets the hard hat policy? Is it the crew leader, the highway official, the elected board, by a contract, state law, or federal policy? What do you think? And you can, by the way, check more than one. You should be able to, though some days these things drive me nuts. Interesting. I've got state, I've got B&E over in the Q&A. This is a good example if we go from the top down now. Everybody can set a policy. If there's no policy, a crew leader can set a policy. The highway superintendent can say, no, I think we should do this instead. That becomes the controlling policy. The board can say, no, this is what we want. They can have the policy. If it's written as a contract or there's a state law or a federal law, those would control. So for instance, if you're getting federal aid, you have to wear a hard hat anytime you're in the right of way. If you're in the right of way doing public work, you have to have a hard hat due to the MUTCD. Okay? So again, policies can be set. If there isn't one, anyone can set it, but it can be superseded by somebody higher up in the chain. And just keep that in mind. This is why it's really good to try to set policies that help everybody. I'm a huge fan of good policies, but remember, a bad policy can be hard to follow and can actually make it more difficult to do your job. So make sure you've got a well-written policy. Now, can a local board pass a law that supersedes a state or federal law? Yes, in every case, due to home rule. Yes, if more restrictive. Yes, with some caveats, or no. And I've got a D in the Q&A. And we've got some people wondering about A, yes, no, yes. Okay. So the answer is B with a little bit of C. In other words, yes, if more restrictive, though there are some caveats. And here's the biggest caveat, and that is, what's more restrictive? Okay? So for instance, area speed limits. We passed a local law state law, excuse me, recently that allow area speed limits to be set by municipalities if they've gone through certain procedures in certain places. Okay? Prior to that, a board could not set a speed limit of 25 and have it enforced by the courts. Now they can if they follow through. Okay? But if they don't go through that process, if they just carte blanche pass a local law, it could be thrown out in court if they said, well, you didn't do an engineering study. Okay? You didn't show that this was the reasonable speed limit to be set. And of course, it could be thrown out in this case because somebody could argue legitimately that that sign didn't meet the standards for being able to be seen. And so the sign needs to be replaced. And it has been, just so you know, by the way. Okay? So you can, but it has to be more restrictive. The caveat, though, is what is more restrictive? More restrictive does not mean lower speed limit in this case. It actually means more control that can be set by the town. And there are some caveats. In this case, speed limits at a town level, with some exceptions, are set by the state. And you can't supersede that at the local level. Okay? Purchasing policy, again, we talked about that. Okay? And the bid limits. So let me ask you, which would be a public works bid item in this case? Dump truck, installing a culvert, installation of a heating system in the barn, delivery of salt, or hiring an engineer? Okay? And now I'm going to go to the responses and see what y'all said. And you get to pick more than one. So only about a quarter of you have voted. And you can vote for more than one. Okay? So a new dump truck? No. A new dump truck is not a public works item. It would be considered a purchase. So your limit is the smaller value of 20,000. Okay? So that would not be a public works. So you'd be limited in that particular case. So keep that in mind. That's a thing. Okay? So you'd be limited to the 25. Installing a culvert? Yeah, that would be 35,000. You'd be good shape. Installation of a heating system. Oh, that's a classic example that it's actually on the margins. If you were just purchasing the things and part of it came with installation, you could argue that's just a purchase. Others could argue, well, there's a service to put it in. And trust me, I've seen people argue both sides of that particular one. That's why I put it in there. It can actually be a challenge. Where does that fit? Okay? Is it a purchase or is it a service? Think about making sure that it's a service that you're getting. Okay? That the installation is something that couldn't just be done by your crew because of time. Okay? Because if it could be, then it probably is going to be considered a purchase. Okay? Delivery of salt. The salt is delivery. No, delivery doesn't count. So this would actually be just a purchase of an item, even though you're paying for someone to drive it to you. And hiring an engineer, remember, that's one of those exceptions. That's a professional service. That would fall outside the range of public works and purchasing policy. You'd have to go to the RFP process to do that. Okay? Let's look at shared services. Now, this is something that comes up quite often. And again, if we had a whole day, we could do a lot with this. But just give me a quick example or two of some shared service activities. Snow removal by other agencies. In Wisconsin, by the way, the counties actually snowplow the interstate system. The most common is snow plowing, but sharing equipment. If you want to borrow something from another agency, it's best to have a shared service thing in writing. Okay? And so you can do almost anything, but the key is you want to have an agreement in place. The old handshake may not be enough. Okay? And then one more time, somebody's have already done here. They've clicked on here. I'm going to clear these. I'll let you just click on here. Where's the edge of the right-of-way? This is in a village, by the way, but it's still streets by prescription. They fall under the same rules, roads by use. Most of you are putting that little chain link fence, which is hard to see in the picture. Heck, I didn't even realize it was there when I took it at first. There's a sidewalk there. Okay? And sidewalks get a little challenging inside of a village, but it could be the edge of pavement. Again, depends whether the village has actually maintained that up to that sidewalk. That utility pole may be inside the right-of-way. Utility poles, again, are a bit of an odd situation. If it were a tree, that would set the right of way. If it's a utility, it may not. And again, we can get into challenging stuff like that, though you want to think about safety from that standpoint. Okay? And the reason this gets important, it can be challenging. Um, Sight distance at a corner. What do you do about sight distance at a corner and things like that? This you can set a local policy for doing something like this and keep that in mind. Okay? And you know, mailboxes, another example. Mailboxes have some rights to be in the right of way, but no, don't let them do this. I mean, what are your options for dealing with dangerous mailboxes? Okay. And yes, I see your question in the Q&A. I'll answer that in just a sec. You can educate people. Okay. You could remove those dangerous ones. Work with the postmaster and the post office. Absolutely. You're certainly going to put them on notice. Speak with the homeowner. You may want to contact their insurance carrier. You may want to set a local policy on what is allowed and not allowed. Okay? So again, if we had 2 hours, we could do a lot more, but just want you to start thinking about these things. And of course, it's all going to come back to those other assigned duties, and other things that you might get assigned. Where do they fit within everything else that we do? Okay? What are you doing beyond the highway department? Okay? So let's see what you guys come up with. Nope, should be everything. Yeah, that's true. Everything generally come back to the highway department. Landfills, water, sewer, and they're all going to have legal basis behind them as well. Now, I do have one question in the Q&A I want to answer, and then we'll get y'all out of here right on time. I have an estimate for a bid of 25,000. Okay, but the bid but the single bid that you got came over 35,000. Okay, you sent it to 35 to 2 or 3 firms. Do you have to rebid publicly? That's a good question. Essentially, what the question is, I think, is you sent out proposals. If it's a properly written contract proposal and you only get one reply back, you can accept that if you can show the others were given a reasonable opportunity and declined. You may want to go back to them and say, hey, and there are ways to do that legally, that essentially says, hey, are you going to submit a bid or not? And you can then document, hey, we submitted it in a realistic way. We only got back one. Really like to see at least two. You don't have to have three. You do have to give 3 people that opportunity. Okay. And again, document, document, document. You have to show that you didn't do something that only one person could possibly bid. So therefore you circumvented what the rules were in the law. Okay. Now, again, with the legal issues today, drainage law next week, we're going to talk a lot more about drainage rules and riparian rights, and we'll be back at roads by use, of course. We'll then do worker safety, highway liability, culverts, work zones, and pavement maintenance, and then we're going to go into our spring workshop series. And with that, I don't see any questions in the Q&A, and I stole 20 seconds from you. I apologize, but hopefully everybody had a good time, a good day. Stay safe. We'll see you at a future webinar. Bye-bye.